Okay, hey, we're going to hit chapter 5 here. We're going to really be moving from the early reforms into really the early reforms, and then into the early stages of the protests, right before the events of Lexington and Concord that are going to lead us into the American Revolution. So let's get started. All right, in the 1700s, the British and the French are really in competition for land in America. Ultimately, the British have a huge advantage. We talked about settlement patterns in the past, and the fact that when the British come over and settle in a place, they bring families, and families typically tend to produce children. And so, the more children you have, the larger your population is going to be. And so, with that, the British are going to have a huge advantage over the French. However, the French also enjoy a different type of, an equally important advantage in the fact that they have such a great relationship with the Native Americans because of their fur trading and their economic relationships with the Native American tribes. And so, as the British population, the English population, begins to swell, they begin to settle further and further westward into lands that are controlled by either Native Americans or claimed by the French. And so then we start to see the British and the French the governments really start to care about this competition. If we look here, this next slide is going to pull up this map for us, and we can see the blue is what's claimed by the French, and this mauve, kind of pinkish color, I suppose, is going to be claimed by England, the British, and then this orangey mustard color is going to be Spain. So you can see, you have Boston, you have New York, Philadelphia. You have your major cities, and as these populations grow, of course, people are going to move westward. And again, the appeal of the New World is the fact that you can own land, you can farm it, and you can, basically be your own boss. And so more and more people are trying to come over and find a way to the New World, to gain that lease on prosperity. Okay, so in 1753, the governor of Virginia is going to send out George Washington. And Washington, I think, is like 21, 22 years old, to deliver basically a letter, in protest of the French building forts, specifically in what's called Fort Duquesne is the problem. And it's going to be right here in Western Pennsylvania. And so Virginia is down here. West Virginia doesn't exist yet. So like it's not that big of a jump for Virginia to go up here and protest the French, right? And so Washington does that. And they construct their own fort, basically where Pittsburgh is today, where the Three Rivers meet. And that's called Fort Necessity. And we can see a little picture of it right there. It's not much of a fort, just a bunch of wood. That's a reconstruction, obviously, right? And in 1754, the next year, Washington is asked to get rid of the French, right? And so Washington shows up, and it's disastrous. The French they capture him, they capture basically the entire British force or the Virginian force. Um, and ultimately, they give them a good scalding and they release them, which is, odd, but it's the 1750s. So what are we going to do, right? And so, the stage is set where England has kind of been, they've tried some diplomatic methods with the French. That didn't necessarily work. So then they up the ante. They try some military measures, and that's met with disastrous results. What's important to realize in this time frame is that war is really seasonal. In Europe, the powers that be, they're fighting wars constantly, um, on the yearly, on the yearly, right? You mobilize your armies in the spring, you fight in the summer, and well, you mobilize your army in the spring after you have the crops in the ground. You fight in the summer, and then you take the winter and the fall off. You set up your winter camp and you train and whatever. As this pattern progresses, you start to see a birth of more professional armies in which the poor from Europe begin to serve more and more in the military as a career. They see this as a chance for advancement, right? And ultimately, some kingdoms, countries, you're going to win territory one year, you're going to lose some the next, but it doesn't really matter because it's gonna be a revolving circle, right? Most of the wars are fought strictly in Europe. Some of them are going to spill over to the colonies. Most of the colonist wars, though, are going to be really, really small scale. You have to realize, like, the populations of most of the colonies during this time frame, a couple thousand people. Boston and Philadelphia are going to be, the larger cities, New York as well. But if you don't have 100,000 people in a colony at this point, maybe you have a million colonists spread out through all of the different colonies. Um, so maybe, I guess technically you could have 100,000, but anyways, relatively small populations. You have King William's War, you have Queen Anne's War, which is basically just an expansion of the War of Spanish Succession. You're not going to need to know any of these wars to understand what we're working at in America, but just know that there's a series of wars that are taking place in Europe in the 1700s, between England, between France, between Spain, the Netherlands. The Holy Roman Empire is still around during this time frame, and so there's lots of military um, fighting, I suppose, right? The War of Jenkins' Ear, which is probably my favorite war name, right? Is fought, and basically that shows this idea that, hey, remember, if we remember going back, the Carolinas were formed to protect Virginia. Now all of a sudden the Carolinas are profitable. Now we got to get something between Spanish Florida and Carolinas, and so hey, let's create Georgia. King George's War, which is a war of Austrian secession, basically who's going to be the Holy Roman Emperor. That spills over into the New World. But the big one for America and for the study of American history is going to be the French Indian War. It's really just a smaller component of the Seven Years' War. That is one of the first global conflicts that not only happens in Europe, but it spills over into the colonies in America. It spills over into the British and French colonies in Asia, and it's going to be one of the major causes of the American Revolution. Right? We can look here at the battle maps of what's going to happen during the French and Indian War. We have fights again for Fort Necessity and Fort Duquesne. We're going to fight for Fort Niagara. We're going to fight for Quebec and Montreal up here. And yeah, the British are somewhat successful. Really in the New World, the war is kind of a tie. In Europe, it's kind of a tie. In Asia and India, the British are really, really successful. So much so that the French ultimately are going to surrender. And because of that surrender, it's going to redraw the maps in North America. We have fighting in India, we have fighting in Europe, whatnot, right? 1757, the British want to end the French influence in North America. They're going to send more and more military there. We capture Quebec. Eventually, we capture Montreal, and the British Navy defeat the French Navy, and they take control of the really important islands, which are the sugar-producing islands in the Caribbean, right? To help ensure that the Native Americans aren't going to join the side of the French, who are their main trading partners, the British sign a treaty with the Iroquois, the Six Nations of the Iroquois, with the Treaty of Easton, and basically just promise that, hey, if they stay out, that the British will treat them well after the war, and they'll stop the colonists from settling into their areas, right? The Treaty of Paris brings an end to the 7 Years' War and the French and Indian War, and basically gives England all of the French territory in North America, east of the Mississippi. And so Britain gets Canada, they get all the lands east of the Mississippi and what's going to become America. and we're there. Spain is given access, or is given land west of the Mississippi, and then ultimately that's transferred back to the French shortly thereafter. It gets a little bit confusing. It doesn't necessarily matter for our thing. So here's the growth. You can see this. These are the American colonies right here. These are the Ohio River Valley, Mississippi River. That this is where we were having the problems, specifically up here, because this is your population base, right? And then after the war, all of that's going to belong to England. And you think, hey, great, we're going to have this long period of peace and prosperity for everybody. The problem is that land east of the Mississippi and west of the Appalachian Mountains is populated by Native Americans, right? And so not only the British have to now, before they had to deal with the French, now they have to deal with their own colonists, and then they have to deal with the Native Americans, and they're trying to make everybody happy. And right off the bat, you're not going to keep everybody happy. The first thing that's going to happen is the Native Americans used to play the French and the British off of each other for better supplies, better trade deals. Right, the French would supply the Native Americans with guns, weapons, and then the British would have to do the same. After the war, England doesn't want to do that, right? They no longer want to arm their potential enemy there, right? And so those relationships with the Native Americans begin to dwindle. The second problem that's going to face England during this time frame is global war costs a lot of money, and so England is going to be faced with a huge amount of debt following the French and Indian War, right? Then the national debt of England is going to double during this 12-year period that we fight the 7 Years' War, right? And these new lands are not only going to cost England more, they're going to cost England money in terms of manpower and ammunition and all the things that they need to do to ensure peace. And so that's going to end up costing England more money, right? And so Parliament needs to find a way to pay off this debt and also, pay for this new empire that they've just inherited. They've just gotten lands in India. They've gotten lands east of the Mississippi. They've gotten all of Canada, and everybody in England is supposed to chip in and help out. And one of the things that we probably haven't talked about yet to this point is the fact that Americans, or what will become Americans, the British colonists in the Americas, have paid very little ways in the way of taxes compared to other colonies. Like, when the British set up their colonies in India, they heavily taxed those colonies. When they set up colonies in Africa, those colonies are later. Those colonies will be heavily taxed to pay for their expenses. North America really doesn't cost England any money until the French and Indian War, and the colonists aren't really asked to pay anything, and so they have this relationship where the American colonists, at least for the first 100 or so years, aren't asked to really pay what they cost, right? And so we have this idea that the Americans, ultimately the American colonists that are living in America during the 1600s, the 1700s, are receiving the benefit of the British colony or the British crown without actually paying for that, right? Following the war, England now controls all of those lands. Most of the land, we've already talked about this. British troops in North America before this were only about 10,000, really a relatively small number. It's going to have to, increase drastically. And Virginia landowners are looking to move west. In Virginia in the 1600s and 1700s, the cash crop is tobacco. Tobacco is very, very hard on the soil. And so typically what would happen is planters would come in, they would burn the land, prepare it for cultivation. They would plant tobacco for 4 or 5, 10 years, somewhere in that range. And then once the land was no longer viable to produce huge tobacco harvest, they would move in, right? They would move on. And so one of the things that Virginia does is they start to speculate on land. Hey, they're basically selling land futures, right? And if the Native Americans don't leave these places and allow new settlers to come in, they're going to lose lots of money, and the wealth of the wealth of the New World is really there in Virginia, right? So the British start to put troops in the forts that were left by the French. Again, it's going to cost them money. The British, who used to have a good relationship with the Native Americans, based on the fact that the Native Americans would play them and the French off of each other, now all of a sudden only have the French, and they can't always be the good guy, right? And so they start to run into problems with the Native Americans, and they start to restrict the sale of guns and gunpowder to the natives. In response to this land encroachment and the overreach, probably of the British government, or the tightening down of restrictions of the British government, some of the Native American tribes are going to revolt. You have Chief Pontiac that's going to launch a revolt against the British and try to win back lands. He does this in 1763. They attack Fort Detroit. They also have followers that attack at Fort Pitt, which was Fort Duquesne. And ultimately, this leads to a race war between the white colonists and the Native Americans. It's one of probably the most I'm not going to say one of the most bloody. It's a bloody affair where the Native American tribes are going to attack settlers. Settlers are going to attack not only the hostile Native American tribes, but also the friendly Native American tribes, right? It's going to result in murdering and scalpings and dismemberments. And I think the book talks about the Paxton Boys, which are here in the notes. And so again, well, not again, you can see that the colonists really have no differentiation for a neutral Native American tribe and a hostile Native American tribe during this time frame, right? Ultimately, the colonists are going to be successful. They kill Pontiac, and they push the Native Americans a little bit further west, right? But to hopefully bring about peace and stability, because the British still want to trade with the Native Americans, right? They don't necessarily care about, George Washington and his land speculations in Western Virginia at this point. The British are more interested in the amount of furs that can come in from the Ohio River Valley, and so the British are trying to create peace between the colonists and the Native Americans, right? And so they create something called the Proclamation Line. This is the line that's going to run right through the middle of the Appalachian Mountains. And basically they say, look, the British say, look, colonists, you guys stay east of the mountain, Native Americans stay west of this line, and everybody will relatively be happy. Just think of like road trips with siblings before you had entertainment systems in the back of your cars. I remember driving to Colorado as a kid. I'm super old, so we were in the back of a 1979 Ford Thunderbird, which is a huge boat of a car, with nothing to do. My brother and I would, aggravate each other, and so my parents would divide the seat. Like, you stay on this side, your brother stays on that side. Nobody crosses this line, and they're trying to keep peace. I would say that probably worked better. That probably worked better than the British idea. My parents dividing the backseat of the car. The Proclamation Line of 1763 is right here. You can see the darker red is what was supposed to be the colonies, and the more muted is going to be the lands that are going to be set aside for Native Americans or for trade, right? Again, we're just repeating the same things. 7-year trade doubles the national debt. New military presence is going to put a drain on the national deficit. And so the citizens and the politicians in Great Britain believe that the colonists in America should have to pay their share of the financial burden, right? After all, they're the ones that are getting the new lands, they're getting the benefit of not having to deal with the French. And we do all that stuff. However, you have to realize that to the colonists, they've had their land taken away, and so with this new proclamation line, and so they're looking at like, hey, what benefit am I really getting out of this situation, right? And so the British, they begin to raise taxes at home, right? Typically, the landowners are the British aristocracy, are the ones that are going to make these tax laws. And so where are you going to tax people? Are you going to tax the land that the aristocracy owns? No, you're going to tax you're going to tax the noble, or you're going to tax, you know, products that are going to be traded. And so all of a sudden, that tax is going to lead to, taxes on imports like sugar and tobacco that are addictive drugs that the middle and working class of England have, become accustomed to, right? In addition to that, you have that where the poor in England are paying taxes and they're upset, and so they're like, well, what about the colonists in America? Shouldn't they help out? And so Britain is going to pass the Currency Act. And so the Currency Act basically is pretty simple. It just says that, hey, the colonists, they can't print their own money anymore, right? And the colonists, they buy something from England, they have to purchase it in gold or silver. And the ultimate goal is not to really punish probably the colonists, but to codify uh, the economic system of trade between the two countries, right? What it does, though, is ultimately brings the American colonists further under the control of the British government by restricting their money supply. Because if we go back and we think about the American colonists, the American colonies in general, yeah, they were founded to find gold and silver, but they don't find any. And so, like, really, what the American colonists are valuable for is that A, they can grow tobacco, and B, there's huge amounts of lumber and forest to build ships, right? And so, because there's not a lot of gold and silver, the colonists rely on paper money to do most of their business, not only at home but also with the British. And so, when England all of a sudden passes this, it's going to put restraints on the colonists' ability to buy stuff from England, and it's going to put restraints on the money supply in the colonies. Just think about, like, if interest rates would jump in America to 40%, that would shut down a lot of development. This is kind of the same thing. It's going to shut down a lot of the paper money loans that are going to go out and the money that's in circulation, right? 1764, we're also going to pass the Sugar Act that actually reduces the price of sugar in the colonies and molasses. But ultimately, the aim of the act was not to tax sugar or to gain money from sugar, but it's to cut down on bootlegging, or the smuggling of goods into the British colonies. Remember, we're in this mercantile system in which the British want the colonists to buy all of their stuff from England. And so the Sugar Act is going to allow the British to kind of strengthen some of those navigation acts that were passed beforehand, right? So they're able to inspect ships. The big part of this, though, is that if you get caught smuggling, you're no longer going to be tried by a local court, but you're going to be tried by a vice admiralty court, which is sponsored by the King of England, right? It's similar to a military court. That court's going to have its allegiance to the king. So before you got caught smuggling sugar into Boston, into Massachusetts, and your Sam Adams or your John Hancock, who's one of the biggest smugglers in the colonies. And you're being tried by a jury of your peers, and they're probably going to look the other way. Just like if we got caught, you got caught cheating in a college course, and you had a bunch of your classmates get to decide your punishment, and all of them are doing something similar to you. You probably wouldn't be punished as severely as if you went before someone that was answerable to the president of the university, right? And so ultimately, taking this trial by jury away, a jury of your peers away, in the Sugar Act is relatively upsetting. It's going to start to sow these seeds that the colonists argue that, hey, losing this right to a trial by jury is going to be taking away some of their rights that are guaranteed to them by the fact that they're British, right? They're not Americans. They're not anything other than British subjects, and so they should be guaranteed the same rights as every British subject, regardless of where they live, by the English Bill of Rights. And so we're going to start to see this movement away from that. Right? The colonists argued the loss of rights reduced them to a state of political slavery. Some colonists even argue that this loss of liberty is a parallel to the enslavement of the Africans that are flowing into America during this time frame. the British colonists are going to see themselves as British, right? They're British citizens. That's what, even if they're born in America, they're still tied to England. And so this indirect tax or the sugar tax basically lessens this footing. And so they begin to really, in some ways, the American Revolution can be seen um, as as an awakening of the colonists that hey, we are different than England. If England's going to treat us different, then we are different, right? So we have the Sugar Act. The next act that's going to come about is really going to cause probably the biggest problem is going to be the Stamp Act. Stamp Act of 1765 is different from the previous acts in the fact that it's a direct tax. An indirect tax is typically paid by an importer. And so the people, or importer or exporter. And so those people that are importing or exporting sugar are going to pay the tax, and they're going to pass that tax along to the consumers. The Stamp Act is different. It's paid directly to the crown. And so you have a tax that every type of printed paper in the colonies is going to be basically a tax that's paid directly to the king or collected locally by agents of the king, right? And so this is the first time that we've had a direct tax, and so this is what these tax stamps look like. They would be on. This is a reproduction of playing cards, but on playing cards, this is what they would look like. So if you buy a stamp tax item, you would pay a tax kind of like I guess you would pay a tax kind of like a sales tax, right? And this is a big shift in taxation from the indirect colony or the indirect taxes that were paid on items of commerce or even taxes that were paid to colonial governments. And so this in combination with that Sugar Act are going to start to bring up ideas like, all right, if I'm a British citizen and I don't have rights to trial by jury, all of a sudden do I have rights? Should I have representation in Congress because I'm paying a direct tax, right? And so we have that. So we have people starting to question their rights. We have the Quartering Act of 1765, in which the British are going to require the colonists to provide barracks for British troops that are being sent over to maintain peace and order in those parts of the colonies west of the Appalachians, right? And so if colonies couldn't provide barracks or wouldn't build barracks, then the British give their armies the right to live in uninhabited buildings, right? And so they can live in barns or empty houses or whatever. And this is ultimately taking away somebody's property, which is a violation of the ideas of John Locke, which we talked about. It's also a violation of the English Bill of Rights. And so we've had multiple violations of the English Bill of Rights. Now we start to see the loss of property. And when you get back into the functions of government, what is the ultimate function of government is to protect life, property, property, and liberty, right? And all of a sudden, the government's taking away property without even representation, like the governmental level. So colonies are required to pay for the cost of lodging and food. And if they don't do that, they're going to run into problems. The English empire is built on this idea of that a standing army is the tool of a tyrant. And so the British, at least in England, have never had a large military force. And this idea is actually going to carry over into the American fabric right up until after World War II. We've never had a large standing army until the end of the Second World War and the Cold War, and then we maintained an army after that. But traditionally, standing army is seen as a tool of a tyrant. And so this housing and feeding the troops in times of peace is seen as this unnecessary burden, and it's problematic. The New York Assembly refuses to pay for the troops that are in its colonies. And we start to see these rising questions, right? Like, is a direct tax a violation of my constitutional rights? Can the English government deny the American colonists the rights that were promised in the English Bill of Rights, right? The colonists don't have direct representation. The English believe that the mother country probably knows what's best for their colonies, and the colonists don't have equal rights. And I think that's where we're going to stop. Well, I guess we'll keep going just for one thing right here. So England also believes that the colonists need the protection of England more than England ultimately needs the American colonies. Remember, the American colonies are not very profitable for the British, right? In addition, the British believe that the American colonists are divided along religious ideas, commercial ideas, or whatever. Like the people in Boston aren't the same as the people in Charleston, South Carolina. The people in Philadelphia are Quakers, and they believe something different than the people in New York. And so the British don't necessarily see the colonies operating as one. They see them as 13 little different countries that can easily be divided against each other. And so that's where we are. The British are going to be imposing new restrictions and taxes, and the American people, or the American colonists, the English colonists at that point, are going to begin to ask different questions. What rights do I have as a British citizen? Am I a British citizen? Do I have, do the rights and privileges of a British citizen in England apply to me, even though I'm in Philadelphia? And those are the questions that we're going to deal with in the second part of this video, or the second part of this discussion. So I will see you when you click on that.